All right, welcome back, everybody. In this module, we are going to be getting into a new branch of psychology called social psychology. A lot of different things that we can explore when discussing social psychology. In fact, we're going to be covering two of the more popular topics that have been covered within this branch of psychology. We discussed social perception and something later linked to it, attraction. But I do want to, when we start talking about social psychology and getting into social perception, first kind of give a lay of the land of what social psychology is about. In terms of what makes a social psychologist, what we're looking at with this branch of psychology is people who are interested in very similar things to what behaviorists were interested in. They look at how the world around us impacts us. They look at trying to explain a lot of the different things that we're doing. But when social psychologists try to tackle these ideas, they aren't fixated on, or at least occupied by, the observable consequences of observable things in the environment. In essence, what social psychologists do that's different from behaviorists is they also include the idea of cognitions and emotions, both in terms of how those are impacting us and how those things can be impacted by the social environment. Another thing that makes social psychologists unique is that they do sometimes in their research study groups, how groups can impact individuals and vice versa. Doesn't mean that all social psychologists look at all of these different nuances. Some can even focus on behavioral principles, while others tend to spend a lot of time on emotions. It varies from social psychologist to social psychologist, but all social psychologists as a whole are interested in that dynamic of studying the person and environment and how those things interact to try to better understand and explain some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. In terms of all the different areas that social psychologists can get into, there are a lot of different things that you could potentially study as a social psychologist. In fact, we often offer a social psychology class at every major research institution around the world. You can study things like aggression, you can look at pro-social behavior, you can look at attraction, you can look at how we perceive others, you can look at how we make sense of ourselves. In essence, there is a large, vast array of different things that social psychologists study. So to look at social psychology as a whole in an intro class, what we really have to do is narrow down our interest into a couple different topics so we can understand how social psychologists might tackle these things and also become familiar with some major terms that social psychologists have encountered along the way. What we're going to do in this first lecture is look at a very popular topic in the early formation of social psychology, something that we called social perception, how we make sense of the situations we find ourselves in, and more importantly, how we make sense of some of the people that we're encountering in those situations. And when we look at social perception and that attempts to try to understand what's going on, there's lots of different things that we could potentially address. In fact, social psychologists in the early 1900s, when trying to understand social perception, had a litany of different questions that they asked so they could address this concept of social perception from a number of different ways. One of the things that people first started looking at in the early 1900s was how and when we started to make sense of the situation and others around us. And once we started to tackle this idea of what we did to make sense of others, what we did to make sense of the world, and explain some of the things that were going on, was we eventually transitioned to looking at whether or not this was something we also did for groups, and whether or not this was something we did for ourselves in the same manner. And essentially, people asked, if we know what we do to judge others, are we doing that same thing to judge groups and to judge ourselves? And this collection of questions led us to some really interesting terms and concepts that I'm hoping we can explore today. And the first set of terms can be explored by looking at that very first question. When do we form perceptions of others? It might be something that you might have asked intuitively at some point in your life. Well, when do we? What most research has suggested is that despite a lot of our best intentions, most of us do tend to judge others and judge situations fairly quickly. In fact, social psychologists in the early 1900s developed a term to explain this effect. They called it the primacy effect. And it's surmised that even though we don't necessarily believe everything we get in from a first encounter with somebody, those first things that we learn about a person or the first things that we garner about a situation tend to carry a lot of weight, significantly more weight than all the other things that we encounter afterwards. And this primacy effect is something that can be seen in lots of different environments. In fact, lots of people intuitively understand the nuances of this primacy effect, even if they're not social psychologists. I'm guessing that many of you, when you were growing up, might have had parents that asked you to dress up, say on the first day of school, or when you went to something that was really important. And you might have hated it. You might have kicked and screamed and pleaded with your parents not to force you to do those things. But what your parents might have unknowingly been doing is kind of recognizing the importance of this primacy effect. They might have realized that the teacher or the, I don't know, pastor or somebody else that you were encountering while dressed up would have formed a more positive impression of you in comparison you were dressed up, say, in something that didn't look very good or didn't fit you very well. And the idea here is that those first impressions didn't necessarily mean that your teacher or somebody else would see you as this well-behaved, perfect child simply because you were dressed up the first time, but it could carry significantly more weight with you, and it might give you a chance to get the benefit of the doubt in next future kind of ambiguous situations where it would be a little bit more difficult to figure out who you were and what you were like. And one of the things that's been shown to really enhance this primacy effect is another thing that we call self-fulfilling prophecies. This odd impact that our initial impressions have on not only our own behaviors, but the person where we're making these judgments about. One of the classic studies that actually highlighted this is one that's kind of fallen under the radar over the years, but I love to talk about in our general psych classes. It was a study done by three researchers named Snyder, Tank, and Burscheid, where they invited college students to come and participate in what they called a phone conversation study. And they argued to these students that they were going to come into a room, talk on a phone with some random person that they had never met, and they were just going to record the back and forth dynamics of these conversations. Now, they, in this study, suggested that we were really interested in was communication between males and females, suggesting that maybe there was something unique and interesting to explore when heterosexual males and females talked on the phone for the very first time and didn't know anything about each other. Now, this was more of a ruse than anything. This was the researchers really just kind of bringing people in to have this phone conversation study, because what they were going to do in this study is indeed have males and females come in and talk to each other, but they were going to embed something kind of unknown into this experiment that really tried to get at this idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. And when they did this, was when they did separate out everybody into their rooms. Girls would go into their own rooms, boys would go into their own rooms. They'd sit them down, tell all the girls they were about to get a call, and just kind of leave it at that, telling them that they were going to have this conversation. It was going to be recorded, and they just wanted to kind of do their best to try to have a normal conversation. But for the males, when they went into their rooms and got them ready to make these phone calls, mind you, this was before cell phones when they were having these conversations, they would bring them into a room with a phone in front of them, gave them a number to dial, but before they allowed the males to dial the phone number, they stopped them and gave them one extra bit of information. They said that the early runs of the experiment had not been going quite the way they had expected, so they decided to make things a little bit easier for the males in this study by finding a way to kind of make them more familiar with the female they were about to talk with. So they told all the males that they were going to slip into the room of the girl that they had been paired up with. And I'm going to take a picture of her and bring that picture back to them so the males could at least see who it was they were talking to. Now, all the males were instructed not to tell the females about this, not to give any indications that they knew what the female looked like or it could throw off the data. but they said that this, in their minds, was really worth it just to make these conversations go more smoothly. Now, instead of actually going and taking a picture of the females, what the researchers did was they gave the males, after they had left the room and come back, one of two pictures. A picture of what most social psychologists would rate as an attractive female, or a picture of a female who would be considered unattractive based on some of the standards and things that social psychologists have actually developed over the years. I know this might seem weird, but just hold off until we get to the attraction lecture and you can see some of the things that have been linked to physical attraction by social psychologists. And just know for this class and this topic that they found a way to indicate a girl that most males would find attractive and one that most males would not find attractive. And again, the males were randomly paired up with one of these two pictures, which meant the girl they were about to talk to was then randomly paired up with one of these two pictures. And then the conversations began. Remember, this was a conversation, a back and forth between a male who had never met this female and a female who had never met this male. And they were just supposed to talk. And as you probably could expect, the males who saw the pictures of these females behaved in a probably very predictable way. The males who were paired up with the attractive photo did all the things that you would probably expect males who realized they were talking to attractive females would do. And that they flirted, they bragged about themselves, they engaged, they talked about the potential of getting together later on. They did all of those typical things that you see lots of college male students doing. And the females responded in kind to an extent, right? They when were flirted with, sort of flirted back a little bit. When we received cold shoulder, they kind of responded in kind. But what made this study even more interesting and really brought out the value of these self-fulfilling prophecies was an additional thing the researchers did after these conversations had finished. So they did indeed record the back and forth between the males and females. And after the conversations had completed, they edited the recordings out to remove the male side of the conversation. Essentially, they had a female talking to an unknown person with a back and forth on a whole bunch of random topics for every female that participated in the study. And they brought these recordings to people who had no idea what the study was about, no idea that there was a manipulation, no idea that these people had been instructed to talk with a random person for 30 minutes. They just were given recordings and asked something very simple. They were asked to rate on a scale of, I think it was 1 to 10, how attractive they surmised these females were, just based on what they were saying and how they were interacting with these male counterparts. And what they found was really revealing. Their research showed that females who were randomly paired with the attractive face were almost always rated as fairly attractive, and the females that were paired with the unattractive face were almost always rated as unattractive. You got to remember, these are random pairings. These females did not look anything like the faces that they were paired up with. It was just a random assignment that they were given. And nonetheless, their behavior changed due to the way that the males that they were talking to perceived them. And somehow an independent third party could somehow derive from these conversations that these females were attractive, or at least seen as attractive or unattractive, by the males they were talking to. This is the power of self-fulfilling prophecies, and this is what really highlights how impactful this primacy effect can be. Not only do our first impressions tend to carry a lot of weight, but they tend to get us to act in specific ways that can then get others to act in the way that we anticipate they're going to act. In the long run, those first impressions really do matter when it comes to social interactions. And this might lead you to then come to the conclusion that, well, this really highlights the importance of making a good first impression. And it also leads us to wonder what happens when people use certain things to make first impressions that are maybe even somewhat unfair. And this led to other research that was very closely related to it when we talked about how people were judged, not necessarily based on what they were doing, but based on the groups that they were a part of. In particular, it led to research on something that we call stereotypes. And when we talk about stereotype research in social psychology, it's first important to note that most social psychologists don't believe that stereotypes are inherently wrong. In fact, most research suggests that we are filled every day with a litany of different stereotypes that we're using to better navigate in the world around us. And some of these stereotypes are based on positive characteristics, some of them are based on neutral characteristics, some of them are based on negative characteristics, but they're kind of our guiding posts so we can know who to interact with and how to interact with those individuals. Let's look at an example of this. Let's say you were studying for an exam and you had to figure out who you wanted to pair up with as you were prepping for the final moments of this exam. The gentleman on the left pictured in the middle, or the gentleman on the right. Now, most of you probably would feel uncomfortable with having to make this decision, but I'm guessing most of you, if you were forced, would make the same decision. You would probably opt to study with the person on the left, suggesting that maybe somehow having glasses, a pocket protector, and unusual friends makes you a better candidate to doing well on the test, and henceforth is probably a person that you want to study with. Where if you wear a Letterman's jacket and are screaming at the camera, you maybe aren't the best study partner. Now, obviously, most of us can recognize that sometimes this assumption would be potentially incorrect. Maybe we did choose to study with the wrong person, but most of us would probably tend to lean on those stereotypes when faced with this decision. That doesn't mean you're thinking only negative things about one person or positive things about another. Let's say you did really well on the test and wanted to throw a party after to celebrate. Who do you ask to go recruit people to come to your party? Do you ask the person on the left or the person on the right? If we wanted to extend this to other groups, let's say you decided that age or dressing habits mattered. So if you asked for a loan or help to throw this party, you might be asked which of the people on the bottom would you ask for finances from? Maybe you would ask for neither, but I'm guessing most of you could pretty quickly surmise what I'm getting at with those two images. If you were asking for fashion tips out of all of these individuals, who would you go to? I'm guessing most of you would probably go to the same person when asking for help on what to wear to this party. It's not that you're going to be 100% right all of the time when you go to these individuals. It's the fact that when you look at these pictures, you can quickly guess what the answer to all those questions I just asked were, and you probably would navigate your life based on a lot of those assumptions that you have. This is at the heart of stereotypes. We use these a lot. If you spill something in a class, you don't just ask any random person you see to help you locate where to mop that thing up or where to pick things up. You look for specific individuals that fit specific stereotypes, and more often than not, it gets you through things. But where does it go awry then? Well, this is when we get into some other terms that have been the focus of a lot of stereotype research, what we call prejudice and discrimination. When those stereotypes start to get paired up with attitudes, positive, neutral, negative, but attitudes nonetheless that relate to those stereotypes, that's when stereotypes can start to become problematic. If you like somebody just because they're a part of a group, or dislike somebody just because they're a part of a group, well, that's when stereotypes no longer have as much utility. And if you start treating somebody unfairly simply because assumptions that you make about them, even if those unfair treatments are positive, you're engaging in another somewhat problematic thing when it comes to stereotypes, and that's what we call discrimination. Now, most early research on discrimination focused on discrimination on some of the more tangible, big picture things that lots of people think of when they hear the words discrimination. People looked at discrimination based on gender, discrimination based on race, discrimination based on sexual orientation, discrimination based on where people were from. Right? Things that most people surmised were kind of inherent within all of us, that we just had to, when looking at outgroup members, people that didn't look like us, form stereotypes about them, and immediately after we formed those stereotypes, have prejudices and discrimination that follow. One particular sort of researcher, more just teacher, questioned that assumption, questioned whether or not these prejudices and discrimination came about only when we were looking at outgroup members and people that we didn't affiliate with. And this woman's name was Jane Elliott. And she ran this really controversial but also very riveting set of, you could call them studies, with a bunch of children that she taught in a very small town in the United States called Riceville, Iowa. And she, for years, put kids through this, what she called eye test, to show how easily we could form stereotypes about things that had never even been brought to our attention, and how once these stereotypes were formed, there could be prejudice and discrimination that followed that led to some really nasty, horrible outcomes. And I encourage all of you, when you get a chance, to look at the video link that I provided with, so you can watch at least the first 10 minutes of a revisit of the original video called The Eye of the Storm. And the one that you have the link to is something called A Class Divided. It actually explores the impact that her original study had on the kids that were filmed, and it allows you to see some of the evolution that Eliot's ideas and research eventually led to. You're only required to watch the first 10 minutes of this video, but if you find it really engaging, the whole video is up and available for you. You just have to see all the different multiple parts that are provided for you on the Frontline video link that I gave you. And hopefully after you watch that, you can see one of the ways that people explored this concept of how we judge groups after we had started talking about things like the primacy effect and self-fulfilling prophecies when it came to social perception. Another thing that people started exploring when it came to trying to judge others was what it was we were actually doing to accomplish it. And how did you determine that somebody was funny, or somebody was boring, or somebody was interesting? And what was it that led us to those conclusions? And this eventually led researchers down the path of exploring this concept that they called attributions, and the process of explaining what it was we were encountering. There's lots of different types of attributions that people have discussed if you look at the history of social psychology, but oftentimes nowadays, people looking at social psychology and attributions tend to argue that we tend to explain situations in one of two ways. We either blame something, we're seeing somebody doing something, on that person, we call that an internal attribution, or we blame something we're seeing somebody doing on what the situation is. Essentially, we're making an external attribution. If you see somebody doing something and you say it's a byproduct of their traits or a byproduct of their cognitive abilities or something about them, you're making an internal attribution. If you're saying, oh, that happened because this led up to it, or these things came together and forced that person to do it, you're making an external attribution. And which type of attribution we make really does have an impact on our perception of a situation. I know the Far Side clip that you see here is a little over the top, but if you look at it closely and read it, you'll see how there could be some pretty big consequences if the aliens in this clip make an internal attribution about Roy's behaviors, where for us, maybe we'd be inclined to make more of an external one as to why he shook the head vigorously of the alien that came to our planet. These types of attributions are what many early researchers studying the ideas of attributions started to try to tackle. One of the questions that was first asked is, well, which ones do we make? When we see somebody doing something, do we have one that we lean on versus the other? There was a resounding response when we first started studying this in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And the resounding response was that we most always, when judging the behaviors of others, tend to make internal attributions. We tend to assume that what somebody's doing is not a byproduct of them, of the situation, not a byproduct of the things that they were forced to do, but really just a byproduct of who they actually are. And in fact, most research didn't just verify this, but showed that we tend to, even in situations where we really should be making external attributions, stick to internal attributions. There was a study done that actually had students come in and write essays about a very polarizing figure at their time named Fidel Castro, the Cuban dictator slash leader, depending upon your perceptions, who was involved in a lot of different incidents with the United States. So what these researchers would do is they'd have students either write a very positive essay about Fidel Castro, a negative one, telling them they didn't really care what they felt, but they were forced to write these essays if they wanted credit for their participation in these studies. And these students would be writing them not only on their own, but alongside other students who were given the exact same instructions. Then the students would turn in their essays that they were forced to write themselves. The researchers would shuffle the essays, redistribute them to the participants, and then ask the participants to rate how much that person whose essay they were given actually liked or disliked Fidel Castro. And what they found was that people tended to, regardless of whether or not they liked or disliked Fidel Castro, assume that whatever somebody else was writing was indicative of their actual feelings. It seems kind of silly if you think about it on the backside. These people were forced to write an essay. They knew that everybody else was forced to write an essay if they were going to be given credit for their participation. But then when they were asked to try to assess why somebody else wrote an essay that was in favor or against this same person that they were forced to write an essay on, they tended to go to explaining their behaviors or trying to assess feelings based on just what these people had been kind of forced to do. It might be a convoluted response there. There's more about this in the book, but just know that the main thrust of these results was that the fundamental attribution error sticks even when it really shouldn't. That's why we tended to call it fundamental. Nowadays, we also have given it other names, so sometimes you'll see it linked as the covariation bias. But in essence, most of us do tend to blame everybody else's behaviors on them, not the situation. And there's been lots of replications of these results, and in fact, we kind of assume that everybody did this regardless of who they were for a number of decades, until in the 1990s, a researcher at UC Berkeley started to question whether or not this was as universal as we had originally thought. And this gentleman's name was Kai-Ping Pong. And he argued that when he came from his East Asian culture, what he called a collectivist culture, these assumptions about everybody doing something because of them are not the same assumptions that he made. He argued that most people in East Asian or collectivist cultures tended to assume that people's behaviors were actually a byproduct of the situation. We ran a whole collection of studies to show that there were differences in this particular form of social perception from culture to culture. I encourage you to watch the first couple of minutes in the video link that I provided for you so you can see some of the work that Pong did and how that really did get us to question some of these things that we assumed were fundamental for actually a number of decades. And when you look closer at Pong's research, what you can also appreciate is his work sort of added to something else that we had encountered along the way. The fact that even though we judge others oftentimes by blaming their behaviors on them, we don't do this for everybody. In particular, once we start getting closer and closer to ourselves, this fundamental attribution error tends to fall apart. When we're explaining the behaviors of, say, a close friend or explaining our own behaviors, we don't always make these internal attributions. In fact, we tend to, when talking about our own behaviors, blame a lot of the things that we're doing on the situation. And one of the studies that really highlighted this was a study done by a pair of researchers named Jones and Nesbitt in 1970, where they had participants come in, write down their own names, write down the names of a family member, and also in this study they used a very popular figure at the time in 1970, a broadcaster on national news named Walter Cronkite. These people would come in, write these things down, and the researchers would run back and compile all these lists of things that potentially happened, bring them back to students, and ask them to explain why certain things happen. So there would be statements like, you failed an exam, your father got caught speeding, Walter Cronkite got into a fist fight at a bar. Random things, some of them negative like the three that we saw, some of them benign, just kind of totally out there, but things nonetheless, and some of them positive. You got an A on a test, your father made a new friend, those types of things. And they asked people to explain why these things were occurring. And what emerged was this thing that's now called the actor-observer effect. The fact that as we get closer and closer to ourselves, we make more external attributions. So for people, when they fail a test, they don't usually blame the failing of the test on themselves being stupid. They tend to blame it on the situation. It was a tough test. The instructor didn't give them enough time to take it, or they had too many distractions that were going on while they were taking the test. And not assume that their poor performance on the test is about themselves. But if they're talking about their father or a family member, they start to become a little bit more split. Half the time they blame it on their father or a family member. Half the time they blame it on the situation. And when it gets to Walter Cronkite, that fundamental attribution rears its ugly head again, and pretty much everything Walter Cronkite does, positive, neutral, or negative, tends to be blamed on him. Now, that positive, negative, neutral component to this is actually something that I also want to address because it was kind of a caveat to this actor-observer effect that researchers noticed at the time. And it led to the introduction of another term called self-serving attribution biases. It was a realization that when people did blame most of the behaviors that they committed on the situation, they reserve they reserve the right on occasion to kind of break that rule. And it was when positive things were happening. For example, if you did fail a test, usually you'd blame it on the teacher or you'd blame it on the situation, like we talked about. That's how the actor-observer effect works. But if you got an A on that test, well, then you reserve the right to change your explanation for why this happened. Suddenly, internal attributions are perfectly fine. You didn't get an A on the test because the questions were easy or that you had lots of time to study or the teacher was very helpful. You got an A on the test because you're brilliant, because you're smart, or you're capable. Essentially, on the positive side, we blame it on ourselves, and on the negative, we tend to blame it on the situation. And this is something that we found time and time again in the United States for a number of decades. But much like the fundamental attribution error we talked about earlier, there was lots of people in the 1990s that showed that this is not necessarily universal for everybody. In East Asian or collectivist cultures, this effect gets turned on its head again. Many people there tend to blame positive things on the situation and negative things on themselves. Now, the implications of this has been something that's been discussed for years. There's people that have looked at how this might impact things like self-esteem, emotions, but also there's researchers that looked at how could impact things like motivation. And what it's come to show us was that the way we interpret these things can not only impact our understanding of situations, but ourselves and how we see ourselves in the environment. It's really important to note that there isn't a right way to do it. It's not that East Asians see the world better than people in Western cultures in the United States or vice versa. It's just there's different ways of seeing the world, and this is the kind of stuff that social psychologists have explored. We've gone through a lot of different things here in this first lecture. We looked at the idea of what social psychology was all about. Then we looked at what social perception research starts to study and some of the major terms and findings that we've run across over the couple decades that we've studied this concept of social perception. There's obviously a lot more that we could have explored, but hopefully from what we covered, you have a better sense of one of the different areas that social psychologists can explore. In our next class, we're going to move on to a different area of social psychology. In particular, what we're going to be doing is looking at the topic of attraction. Some of the things that we've covered here will be revisited in that attraction discussion, but you're going to see a lot of new things that allow us to see of all the different subtle things that social psychologists can explore when they're trying to understand how we both perceive and interact with the social world around us. And for today, hopefully you got a lot from this. Enjoy the readings, and I'm sure I'll see you soon. Take care.